Okay. We've begun our series of studies, lesson number 1, with what God's desire for man was and always was. Essentially, just to kind of do a quick recap, man began in the Garden of Eden, where he was made in the image of God, and it seems that one of the major parts, if not really what it was taught, I don't know exactly what all is included in being made in the image of God, but one of the major things is that man was a free moral agent. He had the power of choice. God has the power of choice. Man has the power of choice. And it seems that that was a major component of that being made in the image of God. And man made a choice in the Garden of Eden, bad choice. And Brother Turner says that God knew man would sin. Now, I'm not at that point, okay? God certainly knew man could sin, I would say. I'm not ready to say He chose to, and God can know whatever He chooses to know. My personal feeling is, I don't know whether God chose to know that. Now, those that say that He did, I'm not going to argue with them because I don't think we have enough evidence to argue. But God knows everything He chooses to know. And it may be that there are some things He chooses not to know. I don't know. Not my end of the stick, so I'm not going to worry about it. Go ahead, Don. Mm-hmm. Okay. We have another hand up? Go ahead. Oh. Yeah. Keith? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like I say, that's, okay, saying God knew something, if He chose to know it, He knew it, okay? God lives in eternity. We live in time. We don't understand eternity. The past, present, and future to God is all present. I mean, that's the only way I know to describe eternity. It's all present to God. So, He knew Cyrus was going to allow Israel to return. What was it, 200 years before he did? Before Cyrus was born? And God foretold that Cyrus, king of Persia, would allow them to return. So, I mean, because that was happening, in God's view, that was happening at the time He stated it. At the time He foretold it, from our view. Because past, present, and future is all the same in eternity. So, but at any rate, in the beginning, so man walks with God in the Garden of Eden. And man sins. Now from that point on, God and man have both been, and I was going to say trying, on God's end it was working on getting man and God back together where they could have that direct communion with each other. Now, because man sins, it can't happen on this earth anymore. That's gone. That's done with. It'll never happen. But God was trying to get man back to a position where man could have that direct access to Him again. And He had to work out a plan, which to our viewpoint has taken a long time to work out. Almost 4,000 years from Adam to Christ, and 2,000 years ago to us. Now, when I only live 100 years, that seems a long time to me, but to God, that's just, like that. So, depends on what viewpoint you're looking at as to how long that took. But that was the plan, to get man and God back together. And there for a time, God chose patriarchs to speak through, chose families of people to be His, spoke through, and especially through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And then finally, in the days of Moses, He chose a nation, the nation of Israel, to be His. But His choosing, and His choosing of Israel was without merit on their part. But His choosing of Israel included a condition that Israel had to choose to be His. Now, they were God's people, whether they did right or wrong at that point, because they were chosen without doing anything special to be chosen. They were not a numerous people. Moses told them, God didn't choose you because you were more numerous than others, because you were more righteous than others, or anything else. He chose you because He loves you. But you have to choose to be God's people, in effect. And they failed to do that. Now, did God know all of that was going to happen? I believe He did. I think there's abundant evidence in Scripture that He knew that this choosing of Israel was not going to work out. But what was His purpose then in choosing Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and choosing Israel? It was to prepare us for what He really wanted. But during that time of the patriarchal dispensation, if I wanted to go to God to find out what He wanted me to do or to receive blessings from God, I had to go to my father Abraham, the patriarch of the family. During the time of Moses and the Mosaical law, if I wanted to bring some kind of an offering to God, where did I have to go? To the priest. And what did the priest have to do before he could offer my sin offering? Correct. He had to offer a sacrifice for himself to get him where he could offer my sacrifice. And I'm going to throw this in here right now. This is extra. That's a little bit different than those who say today that we go to the priest or to the reverend or to the vicar of the church and he gives us absolution of sins, isn't it? The Aaronic priest did not have the right to tell anyone their sins were forgiven. He only had the right to make the offering to God. It was God's decision whether to forgive that sin. And remember, in the very first sacrifice that we read about in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel brought their sacrifice to God. God had regard for Abel's sacrifice, and He did not have regard for Cain's sacrifice. So, it wasn't the priest that made it right or wrong, it was God. And the law of Moses had certain specific provisions for what had to be done with that sacrifice so that God would accept it. And the priest didn't have a right under the Mosaical law to say, God accepts your sacrifice if you did not do exactly according to the way the law specified. And during that period of time, there was a rolling back of the sins from year to year. And we'll get into that just a little bit, how the Scriptures actually states that. It isn't quite that same terminology, but it's the same idea. And so, God chose Israel, but they did not serve Him properly. Now we get to today's lesson. And the key to the whole thing is what? No. Jesus Christ. Remember, if you don't know the answer, it's always Jesus Christ, Wayne says. The pivotal point of the entire story of the Bible is Jesus Christ. We're going to see why in this lesson. In Romans chapter 3, someone turn and read for us verses 23 through 25. It's in the book, but let's read it out of the Bible. Anyway, start with verse 21 and read through verse 26. Okay? And so, man's sin required something more than what man had to deal with that problem of sin up until the time of Christ. And I think the Jews on some level seem to understand that, because they understood that every year they had to go in and keep making sacrifices for sins. I'm not sure they had, I think some of them probably had more revealed to them than what we have written down in the Old Testament. I think David probably had more revealed to him than what he wrote for us. But the average Jew had what was written in the Old Testament. And that was all he had to understand it. And the Old Testament didn't really go into it that much. It didn't really talk about the afterlife that much. It didn't really talk about what the real problem of sin was and what the real solution to it was. It kept giving clues, and some very strong clues, and a really smart fella might have been able to put it all together that God was going to send His only begotten Son down to the world, but we really don't see that in the Old Testament until we see Christ come on the scene and John the Baptist began preaching. Do we? It's made clear, I mean, just, hammered home then. Go ahead, Don. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Turn and read Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 22, someone. Okay. So from the beginning, when Noah built the ark, and he took the animals, the little song goes 2 by 2. Was that true? Did he take 2 of every kind of animal? Oh, what's wrong with that? Yeah, but, how many of the clean animals did he take? Each clean animal? 7. We don't have God's instructions that He gave the patriarchs written down for us at that time. But God gave some instructions. I mean, for Cain and Abel to know they needed to bring a sacrifice, I don't know that Cain and Abel's sacrifice may not have been a sin offering. I don't know. because it just says they brought a sacrifice. And it doesn't appear that Cain's offering was the wrong thing, to me at least. Okay, so a lot of people disagree. A lot of good Bible scholars disagree with me on this point. So I just want to say this is my thinking. But God did, in fact, regard the animal sacrifice in that case, which was Abel's. And that's something that I will concede. But at the time of Noah apparently had some kind of instructions. Because he took 7 of each clean animal, and what did he offer on sacrifice when he got out of the ark? Clean animals. So apparently there was some kind of instruction from God to him in that regard. What it was, how God said it, I don't know. We're not told. But that would have been a good reason for him to have taken 7 of every clean animal, so he would have had some extras to sacrifice and some to procreate. If he had only taken 2 of each clean animal, well, they would have had to procreate it in the ark, which wasn't in the plan. We don't see that happening in the ark, at least from our perspective, what we're told of the story. We don't see the animals procreating in the ark. So, go ahead, Don. Well, it says by faith. Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So, if he had faith, God had to tell him something. And so he offers these sacrifices, and then Abraham builds altars, and he calls on the name of the Lord. And what does God tell Abraham finally to do at one point about sacrificing and shedding blood? Sacrifice his only begotten son. Well, not his only true son of promise, put it that way. Ishmael was a begotten son, but not the son of promise. He told him, you sacrifice your son of promise to me. And Abraham did that. Hebrews tells us he did it. In his mind, the deed was done before God stayed his hand. So he did it, in effect. And of course, that was a precursor to God sending his son to be sacrificed for us. And so the Hebrew writer says in chapter 9, as we just read here, that without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. Why is the shedding of blood so important to the forgiveness of sins? What did the law of Moses say about the blood in Leviticus? The life is in the blood. Okay? So, if life is in the blood and sin kills, what does it take to redeem, to make one alive again? It takes blood. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So that's how blood comes into the picture as far as the forgiveness of sins and the making one who has sinned to be pure again. But under the law of Moses, that blood of bulls and goats was not able to fully cleanse one from sin, because what happened every year? Okay, there was a remembrance made of the sin. That Hebrews 10. That's right. Turn to Hebrews chapter 10, and let's just read verses 1 through 10. Somebody, whoever gets there first. Okay, so now, what was the law of Moses perfect? Let's ask that question first. Was it perfect? Okay. Well, I disagree with that statement. The law was perfect. Okay? It was perfect. There was nothing wrong with the law of Moses. You sin, you face the consequences. If you act righteously, you get the consequences. Which means if a man lives sinlessly perfect, he could earn his way into heaven. What was the failing? Go ahead, Don. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. Go ahead, Keith. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So, yeah. So there's two senses really in which you can talk about was the law perfect or not, and you have to understand that the law was perfectly righteous. There was nothing wrong with it. It was not sin. It was not sinful. It was not imperfect in anything. But because of man's perfection, the imperfection of the law was it could not forgive sin. Did I just completely blow that, or did that make sense? Want to make sure. Okay. It was burdensome, yeah. He realized God knew it before he started. It was getting us ready was the whole purpose of this thing. God put us in the Garden of Eden, which was a perfect place. Man didn't live up to it. God talked to man through the patriarchs. Man didn't live up to it. God gave man the perfect law of Moses, and man didn't live up to it. Now what's left? Well, there's only one thing that can be left, and that is for him to send his only begotten Son to shed his perfect blood for us, so that we, in spite of our sins, can be made perfect. By grace. Now, anybody that tells you that I stand up here, and I'm not going to speak for every preacher and every local congregation that has Church of Christ on the sign out front. I'm going to speak for Mark Morris. Anyone that accuses me of preaching salvation by works is wrong. Salvation is by grace, and it's by grace only. The works that I do cannot possibly earn salvation. Salvation comes because Christ came down to this earth and died for me. He shed His perfect blood for me, so that I don't have to be sacrificing bulls and goats every year and only being able to have my sins rolled back. Keith. Mhm.
Already.
Okay, well, in reality, though, the law dealt just as much with the heart as the law of Christ. When we look at it, what was the primary commandment? Love God. Okay, that's the heart. If you didn't love God, what did God say in Malachi? They were bringing their sacrifices to Him, but Malachi prophesied and said, God wants the doors of the temple shut so that you can't do what He told you to do anymore because your heart's not right. The law did actually deal with the heart, and it required faith just as much as the law of Christ does. But they didn't live up to it. There wasn't a propitiation equal to man's sin in the law of Moses. That propitiation is provided by the blood of Christ. And even though I do the works that God has given me to do, I'm not worthy to do those works. I'm not worthy to be baptized. You know, I've talked about this before. I'll say it one more time. Baptism is not just being dipped in a little water back here or out in a river or wherever it might be in some mud hole in India. Baptism is a likeness of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. And it brings me in direct contact with Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. That's how it saves. It's not just as simply being dipped in a little bit of water and obeying God's will. I come in contact with the one act that was the once for all sacrifice for sin when I'm baptized. And the same with you, of course. So I'm not worthy of being baptized. That's, by the way, that's one of my little pet peeves when people say get baptized. You are baptized. You don't get baptized in my book. And maybe that's just semantics, okay? But I say you be baptized, not you get baptized for that reason. It's not something I do. It's something that I actually am allowed to do, if you will. And that's grace. That's grace. It's not works. Doesn't have anything to do with me. It has to do with Christ and His sacrifice for sin. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 5, though, and let's see what the problem is between the priesthood of Aaron and the priesthood of Christ. Hebrews chapter 5, read the first 10 verses. Was Melchizedek a priest that was greater than any of the Aaronic priests? Okay, let me ask. Jenna, did you? Okay. Who gives tithes? If Tom, what do you got to say? Well, we don't know, but yeah. Okay. Okay. No, Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek. Who was the greater one, Melchizedek or Abraham? Melchizedek. You don't give tithes to one who is lesser than yourself. You give tithes to one who has greater authority. Melchizedek was the one that had greater authority. Who was Aaron's ancestor? Abraham. Right? So was the Melchizedekian priesthood superior to the Aaronic priesthood? If Aaron's ancestor gave tithes to Melchizedek, it obviously was. And the Jews recognized this. In their whatever Talmudic writings or whatever, they did recognize the Melchizedekian priesthood as being superior to the Aaronic priesthood, but they didn't really know what to do with that. But they all viewed Melchizedek as being the greater. Now, do we know where Melchizedek came from and where he went to? To this extent, we do. He came from God and he went back to God. We know that. Where did Christ come from and go to? He came from God, he went back to God. Or he came from heaven, we might say, and went back to heaven. He was God. So, but he still did come from the Father and went back to the Father where he's seated at the right hand for eternity. The Melchizedekian priesthood did end when Melchizedek left this earth, on whatever way he left the earth. And I'm just going to throw this in for extra. I personally think that Melchizedek was probably Shem, but that's my, that's one of those questions that I want to ask when I get to heaven, and when I get there I probably won't care. So, who was Melchizedek? I'd like to know, but anyway. But he was greater than Abraham, and Aaron was Abraham's descendant, so he was obviously greater. His priesthood was obviously greater than the Aaronic priesthood. Now we have a reintroduction of that in Jesus Christ, who is greater than Aaron or any of the priests of Aaron. But let me ask you this. Did a priest under the law get to choose to be a priest? Okay, he was born of the tribe of Levi, but did that make him a priest? Yeah. Not every Levite could be a priest. You remember in the story in Judges, in the story of the Danites and the young Levite named Micah, who was chosen by, I can't remember the man's name, to be his priest, and then the Danites came through and they stole the man's idols and they stole Micah, his priest, and said, "You be a priest to us." Micah wasn't a priest. He didn't have any right to make that choice. He wasn't a descendant of Aaron. At least that's the indication in that story. He was just a Levite. Now the Levites were helpers to the priests, but they could not be priests. No man can choose that for himself. So there's a very great distinction between Aaron and his priesthood and Jesus' priesthood, which was after the order of Melchizedek. Which one was superior? That's kind of a stupid question, I know. But, we had a little trouble with answering who was superior, Melchizedek or Aaron, so I wanted to make sure we were all on the same page here before we move on. Of course, the Christian priesthood was superior. And it was obviously superior to the Melchizedekian priesthood as well. But that's not the point that's being made here. Go ahead, Don. Chapter 7 of Hebrews, and we don't have time to really get into that, but read that when you get home. Read that whole chapter. Chapter 7. It deals with the Melchizedekian priesthood and Christ's priesthood and talks about the superiority of that. And it's wonderful reading. It really opens your eyes as to what God really wanted His priests to be. But what He couldn't ask for under the law of Moses because mankind was not ready to give it to Him. God, remember, in the beginning, and I think we got maybe 1 minute left, 2 minutes. God in the beginning had direct contact with man. Man had direct access to God. He lost that because he sinned. God, I'm going to use accommodative terminology from our perspective, okay? God tried to reinstate that through the patriarchal dispensation. It didn't work. Now, I believe God knew it wasn't going to work from the beginning. But He had to show us it wasn't going to work anymore. But He tried to give man that same access, basically, that He had in the Garden of Eden during that patriarchal period, and it didn't work. And so then He instituted the Mosaical dispensation. And these are not periods of time. These are ways of dispensing God's will to man. Patriarchal dispensation actually continued with the Gentiles all the way up to the time of Christ. There were patriarchs. The wise men who came from the Far East were apparently non-Jews to see Christ born. Somehow they had an access to God and an access to His prophetic word. And they were told, follow that star. Not through the law of Moses. So we see there, that's just one example that I can give. But now, during the Mosaical dispensation, we have the law being given. Man now has to go through this sacerdotal priesthood, and the word sacerdotal means of or relating to the priests. He had to go through this sacerdotal priesthood to gain access to God, to get forgiveness of sins, to get any of the blessings that God wanted for man. And what did Eli's sons do? They took advantage of it. They laid with the women in the door of the temple. They took bribes. They did all, and Samuel's sons did the same thing. The priests became corrupt, and the system didn't work. So now what's God going to do? He's going to bring His only begotten Son, and He's going to give people direct access. But not what we had in the Garden of Eden, because now we understand that can't be had anymore. But we still have a direct access, and we'll talk about that more on Thursday night. So please come back Thursday night and we'll finish this story out, and then we'll be ready to move into what did God actually institute on the day of Pentecost? What was actually put in place on the day of Pentecost? Thank you for your help this morning.